But first, I want to welcome our first guest of the evening. He is a politics writer over at Slate, formerly at the American Prospect. Alex Sammon, thank you, Alex, for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
People should be following Alex. I think a really good pickup over by Slate. Insane output. Like among these writers, like I'll mention David Dayan, a former colleague of Alex's over at the Prospect. Like I don't know how they do the output. Like I know how I put out podcasts all the time, but like these important, like well researched pieces, I don't know how it does it. But he's got a new one that came out in Slate on March 27th. I'll just share the title here, or the page, called Joe Biden. There it is. Joe Biden. What the heck is Joe Biden thinking lately? After his historic midterm wins, he's suddenly tacking right. A new hire may be right. Before we get into this personnel, Alex, let's talk about two of these sort of right leaning decisions that Biden's made. The first being the Willow Project, which we haven't covered on this. So just explain to folks what the Willow Project was or is.
Yeah, Willow Project is a fossil fuel development project pushed forward by ConocoPhillips. It's basically a massive drilling operation on federal land in Alaska, and so it's the sort of coming to fruition of a larger sustained campaign to open up some of these oil fields in the Arctic, and it's something that they ConocoPhillips put a lot of money into lobbying for. They were hoping to get, and I think a lot of people thought that they weren't going to get because Joe Biden had said on the campaign trail very unequivocally that he would not support drilling on federal lands. Period. Was the quote. And then surprise, they were granted permission basically to start this project. So it's a multi-billion-dollar drilling operation, and they're off to the races on that.
Yeah, I mean, in the obviously we all know the climate change context of that. Like, is that like Joe Biden just doing a solid for ConocoPhillips? I just don't quite understand. Like the stuff isn't going to like help us be energy independent, or there's no like really good gloss on this that he can put on it. Is there?
Right. Yeah. It's one of those things where, like, I think that obviously there's a sort of like impulse to be like cynical about this whole thing and be like, oh, of course, like Biden is just a dishonest guy, and of course he was always going to do this. He's victim to this corporate capture, and he's corrupt and whatever else. But I actually think that the answer is a little more sort of like frustrating and confusing than that, because right, there's no obvious sort of political angle on this. It's not like it's not going to bring down gas prices, right? We're not going to see the impact of this decision in his political lifetime, maybe his lifetime period. And it's not like he's really particularly close to ConocoPhillips above any, far and above any other particular corporation or corporate interest group or, the other thing is that he actually like supposedly really cares about like not breaking campaign trail promises. So it's like these decisions are actually kind of surprising, and I think that they caught a lot of Democrats by surprise. Is the other thing. So I think there are a lot of like Democrats in DC, especially progressives, who really didn't think this was coming. Like, were genuinely surprised by the outcome, and I think that there are people within the White House even who were surprised by this. So, I mean, also worth pointing out, Deb Haaland, who runs the Department of the Interior, was probably the most progressive cabinet pick of anyone, right? So it's coming from a department where progressives really feel like they have strong allies, and it's a confusing one for a lot of reasons.
I'm curious about Holland. How would you rate her sort of tenure?
It's really interesting. I've really pushed on this. I've written about it like, about a year ago when the early numbers on federal leasing or lease, oil and gas leasing on federal lands were coming out, and like the most jarring numbers were coming out of New Mexico. New Mexico, I think, was like breaking records with how many oil and gas leases they were meeting out on federal land. And obviously, Deb Haaland's from New Mexico. She is, has been a really vocal, person on climate change. The sort of story that I've heard repeatedly is that like Haaland is great, and then every other person in the Department of Interior beneath her is like an oil and gas industry person, and so they're just basically, they basically have ring fenced her in a lot of ways, and she can't, like, there are certain things she's been really good on, like indigenous rights and some of this national monument stuff. But then also the sort of like old Obama era holdovers in the Department of Interior have sort of outstripped her on a lot of things and have a lot more power than I think we know outside of that department. So I think there's sort of like two separate stories there, but I haven't heard a lot of people being like, Deb Haaland is a sellout. This is, so predictable and like we can't believe what's happening or whatever. It's kind of it's a different story than I expected, which is that like she's good, but also everyone else in the department is horrible.
It's been really interesting seeing like Biden in like the oil and gas industry, because like the politics of it are a bit confusing, right? Because like in the Permian Basin, both like here in Texas and in New Mexico, they've been giving out permits like it's been a bonanza. And yet, like I remember, I think it was last year, like Biden had given out the most permits in the Permian Basin in Texas in like recent memory by a long shot. And of course, still like Abbott and the Republicans here are like Joe Biden and like the crazy radical Democrats are stopping oil production in the state of Texas, right? So it's one of those things where it's just like, with all of these moves for Biden, and I'm not someone who's sitting here with like high expectations or anything like that. Like the politics always seem confusing because it's like he's going to get hit hard by the right no matter what he does on this issue in particular. As like as a green, as like a somebody who's against the oil industry, and yet continues to see in a lot of ways like bend over backwards, at least here regionally, for that industry. And I like the play beyond it just sort of seeming cynical. It's always confused me a bit.
Right. It's just like, right. You just can't outflank the right on these things. Like there's just no level of being like, oh, actually we funded the police that diffuses that. And it's like insane. Like those conversations just make you want to smash your head in the wall because they're so obviously pointless. There's nothing tactical about that. And I think some people are aware of that. And yet, onwards we go with this stuff.
And now let's talk about the other decision, this revision of the DC criminal code.
Yeah, so that's another one where I think this is actually even a bigger surprise because DC obviously DC did this revision to its criminal code, which if the actual facts about it, it's very surprising to me that this became a national issue. They basically did some criminal justice reforms. They weren't that substantial. I think on balance were good. They were enacted in a very straightforward and democratic way by elected officials and like vetted by a bunch of experts and like all these stakeholder groups. Like it was pretty much the most down the line sort of down the middle sort of legislative reform you could possibly do. And obviously there's this, crime panic and all this stuff. It didn't even seem actually like this was going to be an issue for Democrats. Like when this first came up as a possibility that Republicans would go after the DC criminal code rewrite as a possible repeal, the sort of prevailing wisdom on this was like, this will be Biden's first veto. Like everyone was sort of operating under this assumption that Biden's going to veto this Republican-led thing because it's so obviously ridiculous. It's such a sort of lame attempt to score points and like gin up crime panic. And then like basically overnight, it went from this is for sure not going to be supported by the president to, and House Democrats are like, even House Democrats in House leadership who are close to Hakeem Jeffries and stuff, like not progressives, were like, we'll stand against this, whatever, open and shut. And then basically overnight, the White House comes out and says, and they sent a letter saying basically we're going to veto this. Then they come out basically overnight and say, actually, if the Senate votes to repeal this, we will support this. And it ends up getting crushed. Like this Republican-led attempt to repeal this rewrite ends up winning like 85-15 or whatever in the Senate. And Biden says he supports it. And that's that. And that was another one that just like totally came out of left field, that the people on the Hill who, work for Democrats in the House and in the Senate were like, what happened? Like they were furious because they are given no guidance that this, not even a heads up. And so I think that, again, another one of these things, like the politics of it, totally confounding. The sort of lack of communication, the actual sort of like nuts and bolts as to how it happened, I think really telling and important, actually, maybe even more so than the ideologies behind these decisions. And I think that's kind of like probably what gets us to talking about the new chief of staff. So
Yeah, and so like Dave and I haven't been happy with Joe Biden during the Ron Klain chief of staff time. Basically like a half loaf, if you want to call it that, to progressives. But like it does seem like this new shift is be like a fu to progressives, which is. Can you just talk a little bit about Klain just briefly, and then we can get to Zions.
yeah, totally. Yeah, so Klain, I'll say like I had my fair share of skepticism about Klain. I really wasn't that enthused by him when they first got him in there. The first year where he was chief of staff, it seemed like there was this sort of familiar pattern where he was giving progressives access and like would invite them to the meetings and stuff, but didn't really seem like he was going to seek out and enforce these progressive priorities. It just seemed like he was going to placate with access, which is kind of a tale as old as time in a lot of ways during Democratic administrations. But actually, over the course of the 2 years, I think that he kind of proved me wrong in some ways. I think that the way in which he like took up certain things, especially like judicial appointments, and really like pursued progressive judges and stuff for these lifetime appointments, was something that was like an initiative that he took. His sort of willingness to communicate with progressives in leadership, like Pramila Jayapal, like really sort of like built out these relationships and had like active lines of communication. And like that may seem like nothing, but it actually was something. And it was something like very aberrant for Democratic presidencies. Like we really haven't seen that. And so I think at the end of these 2 years, and I think the other things we're saying is like, kind of like pushed for some of these progressive policy initiatives on, on debt cancellation, other stuff. And also like kept other more conservative, more corporate people out of the decision-making process. And so I think like all those things together, you would say that like his influence in the Biden White House was important because he was making decisions and he was in conversation with people who were generally locked out of these things. And I think that, if you looked at his record on balance, you would say that as someone who came from like the Clinton White House, a really pleasant surprise, and not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly not like I don't know, like he wasn't a progressive. He wasn't like a
Right.
born and bred sort of like ally of this group. But he, all things considered, I think had a pretty good run, and I think it made progressives feel really sort of optimistic about where the White House was, and brought Joe Biden along on a lot of things.
Right. And so Zions, who's he? Where's he from? And what should we know about Zions?
Yeah, totally different kind of guy. So Zions is like a serious Obama stalwart, and I think that like a lot of things about him can be basically explained by that simple fact. He's like a corporate consultant. He came through Bain. He kind of built this huge business empire, doing corporate consulting and strategy, and some investment stuff, and it's just sort of like a creature of like the business elite in this country in a lot of ways. And he came aboard in the Obama administration, worked in the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, and basically Obama told him to like cut government activity that wasn't efficient. It was like this sort of like very obvious Republican inspired sort of like, we're going to streamline the government with our embrace of these business platitudes or whatever. And that was like his role. Like there are these stories about how people on the Obama jobs board thought he was actually a Republican, and he's just like was part of the fiscal cliff strategy that was such a catastrophe. Just someone who really had built a reputation for buttering up the business class, doing their bidding, and existed in the Obama administration for a long while. And I think that that's really who he is. That's kind of at bottom who he was. He obviously was in the Biden administration as well. He was the COVID czar, which we can also talk about. But someone who I think was really an Obama ally, really sort of showcased Obama's desires for how to run a government, which was incredibly business friendly and business oriented, and very much not amenable to the left flank of the party.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me of, speaking of Obama, and you mentioned this in your piece, like the Rahm Emanuel era of, like, this guy's in here to be a hatchet man against the left, explicitly, and it's almost like Biden's going in reverse, because like the Obama administration, Rahm's in there from the beginning, and then he eventually gets out. I don't remember who his chief of staff was after that, but it seemed to me, and this is just my recollection at the time, that Obama was actually getting more open to progressives, like at least the Cuba stuff, Iran, like, and I don't know how he's dealing with like congressional leaders, but like at least his policy seemed to be heading up the more positive direction than his early days. And Biden, it seems like his second term is going to be like more right wing. It looks like.
Yeah, it's crazy because, right, it's one of these things where I think you and I would disagree with this political wisdom because I think it's just factually incorrect. But the idea that, like, oh, you have to tack right ahead of elections, like you have to tack right ahead of the midterms, ahead of the general, like you have to triangulate, you have to make all these, these tough choices to like appeal to the elusive moderates, because that's what it all comes down to. And like the Biden administration is living proof of the fact that that's not true. Like they, on two separate occasions, which I think is really critical, after the Democratic primary in 2020 was over and run up to the general election, the Biden administration, tacked pretty aggressively to the left with the announcement of the $2,000 check stuff. They didn't have to do that. They ended up doing it. They ended up winning. They ended up winning those Senate seats on top of it. And then again, in the most recent election, they waited on the student debt relief until the sort of 10-week run up to the election, and that was something. And they had the IRA signed in that 10-week extended window or whatever. So two big things, signature things. Certainly not tagging to the right, tagging to the left, if anything. And then both those times you had really good election results. I mean, those midterms were, historically impressive in terms of, a president's party winning a midterm election, especially even if the economic conditions. I mean, really. I mean, those things would say, like, look at the Biden administration is proof that this, you don't need to do this. And the Obama administration was proof that the other thing doesn't work. I mean, the fact that they lost 1,000 seats, this over the course of their time, like it's really cut and dry in some sense. And then now you have Biden, cutting the other direction, tacking right at a time when it makes no sense. You already have this very, very recent data point that says doing the opposite works, and everyone there is living proof of it. It's really confounding. And I think that, not to go on too long here, but I think part of it is actually just the sort of tyranny of proximity, which is that, like, Zients is just around, and he's like in the White House, and he's catering, he's sending free bagels to the White House once a week. I mean, sometimes the stuff is as simple as that. Like, it's not even about ideology, it's about relationships. And that's definitely about has been good at times. So it's something about him that can be really frustrating. But I think that it's as much as, like, he owns a bagel shop. He sent free bagels to the White House every Tuesday for the first 2 years. Everyone's like, oh, this guy's great.
And it all that seems to like point to like a lack of intentionality among Biden that I think is like, as a very old guy running for his second term, like that seems like a liability to me.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's like in one hand you have Biden pursuing this very different course for Democratic politics, which is like, again, I think there's a lot of criticisms to be made of this, but like this sort of like labor and judicial appointments, progressivism, it's like more money for social services. It's not like the sort of FDR thing where they're like going to come after these corporate CEOs and like wring their necks and like, but there is like this stuff on antitrust, there's this stuff on labor, and there's this stuff on digital appointments that just hasn't been a part of Democratic politics at all for a long time. And that's a real thing that Biden is doing differently. And then at the same time, you have him bringing in people like Zients who are totally opposed to that. And I think that in his own mind, it's like those two things aren't clearly at odds, because he's just a creature of DC, and he has his friendships and his relationships and, like, the guys he trusts to go enact this stuff. And that was really what people were talking about Zients at the beginning, was that, like, oh, he's just hyper competent and he'll just, really enact this stuff. He's not an ideologue. It doesn't really matter what his background is, which of course isn't true. But you have these things that are like legitimately at odds. And I think that it's not that Biden is faking all the good stuff and is actually all the bad stuff. I think that there's just this tension at the heart of the party that he actually embodies kind of neatly himself, which is that, like, they want to do these different things, but then also they're so beholden to these people who've been around doing the other thing that they sometimes just do that instead. I mean, also like, right, there's so much money in lobbying and corruption, all this stuff, like not to discount any of that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, total, and like, look, because I can already see some people like getting mad at some of the things we're saying here. It's like there's a point about recognizing like the failures or the things we disagree with in the early Biden administration, right? And like you could make the argument, maybe that I heard some people on the left making the argument that, you know, one of the things that was so dangerous about the first 2 years of the Biden administration was like kind of half measures like IRAs, like something that was like historic, right? It was a massive you know, legislative agenda. It moved the ball on climate change, but it also like embodied like the worst of Washington, right? It's like over reliant on the market, tax credits instead of like, you know, government, like direct government action, all these kind of things, right? So you could make the argument that under like the previous system, that like the left sort of represented, but it's almost represented in a way that like, all right, we'll take half measures to sort of, you know, demobilize or like cajole or confuse folks, right? What we've seen like very recently is like a very stark you know, shift from like the pipeline to things from the Biden administration, like for example what's happening at the border now, you know, with this app, which is just like out of this world. I gotta say, every time I bring it up, that like there is no better metaphor for this administration than effectively making a really cynical use of a COVID policy permanent and attaching it to an app. But right, the question has to be that, like, you know, who is this for, and what is this going to mean for the Biden administration and the Democratic Party going forward? Because, like, again, I don't think any of this stuff is winning over Republicans, and I wonder how well it even plays with like the suburban voters that they might have sort of been able to pick up in Georgia and parts of Texas and parts of the country. That I do think the Democratic Party is really looking to sort of reconstitute their base as like that, you know, more well-to-do suburban voters who might have traditionally or historically voted Republican. But I'm just curious, like, you know, do you think that it is solely the in the sense of like, okay, the chief of staff has sort of changed, and that means that who has his ear is changing? Or do you think that there is like some kind of internal strategy here that going into this, you know, next election they might need to tack this way?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. I think that those relationships actually are, you know, I think I probably already said this, but like those relationships are end up being hugely important. Like that's one of the most maddening things about the way politics works in DC is that like it's so much about, right, who you like and who you have access to. And like Science just has a bunch of corporate CEOs on speed dial, and he doesn't have the phone numbers of activists, and he doesn't want them. And so like, how is his worldview influenced by that? It's really obvious. And then, you know, then he brings two more lobbyists into all of his decision-making meetings. And those are the three people who are influencing Joe Biden. And all of a sudden things look totally different. That's definitely a huge part of it. I think that's, you know, part of the reason why like the fight over these staffing decisions were really important in the beginning of the administration. And I think people also forgot just how bad it was under Obama, like how contemptuous like the Rahm Emanuel operation was. And yeah, I think that there is some sort of like notion that they're doing something politically wise. I mean, it's just like one of these things. It's like this election is, you know, 20 months away. There's just no, if you really think that you could move people on the margins with these decisions, like that, you think that they're going to remember this and not all the stuff that's going to happen subsequently in the next 18 months. It's just like, it doesn't make any sense. It's like, you know, if that were the case, then people would have been voting in November based on what happened on like March 10th of 2021. You know, it's like, yeah, I really don't think that I don't think it makes any sense. I think there's this sort of like prevailing wisdom that I think that you'll see with like just moderates in general who are like, oh, great, of course, like he's just doing the smart thing he has to do. And it's like, there's just no evidence that that's the case. He's just doing, you know, he doesn't have to do it. That's just like, just to make that very plain and clear. And yeah, I don't know. It doesn't feel like they're like winning concessions on stuff out of it either way. It's like, you know, it'd be one thing if you could say like, oh, there's some obvious horse trading here. Like, you know, Manchin gets this, and then all of a sudden we're going to get all these nominees through the Senate or whatever. But the Senate's more gummed up on nominees than it's ever been. And despite the fact that Democrats added a seat in November, and yeah, I don't know. I think it's really confounding. I think you know, I mentioned this piece too, that there's like some recent polling about Biden's favorability, and you can see like it's getting worse with Republicans it got worse in Republicans in March than it's gotten in a long time. So like these gestures aren't appealing to Republicans. They aren't appealing to conservatives. And, you know, so what are we doing?
Governing, baby. Alex, where should people follow your work at?
Yeah, you can read me at Slate. I'm there, you know, frequently. I'm on Twitter at Alex_Sammon. If you want to find me there, I'm also there frequently, probably too frequently. But yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Alex. Really appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Great talking to you guys.